And at this time, it is my great honor and privilege to be able to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. We're about 20 minutes behind, which for a Muslim event is pretty good. So thank you guys for sticking around. But he was born in New York City as a son of Jewish Holocaust surviving parents who faced the Warsaw ghettos and the Auschwitz concentration camps during the Holocaust. He received his PhD from Princeton University as a political scientist, specializing specifically in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is a world-renowned professor, author, and activist, and has recently become the face of leading the charge against the apartheid regime, but as we all might know, has been doing this noble work for many, many years now. Without further ado, it is my great honor and privilege to be able to call to the stage our keynote speaker for this evening. Give it up for Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me. And of course, I am very pleased to be among you. There have been what appear to be important developments in the past week. What will come of them is, I think, speculative, though I do believe certain aspects of this ceasefire we can predict with a high degree of probability what will or won't happen. But I will leave that for the end, and I probably won't speak at great length on it. I rather look at what we do know with a high degree of certainty 15 months after October 7th. Now, I would divide what we can speak of with a certain amount of certainty. I would divide it into two categories. One category is the factual record, what actually has transpired the past 15 months. And it's my opinion that that record is uncontroversial, incontestable, irrefutable. And in a moment, I will try to explain why. But there's a second aspect where I do believe reasonable people can disagree. Those are questions not of fact, they're questions of moral judgment. And reasonable people can make or reach different moral judgments about certain aspects of what occurred on October 7th and thereafter. As a matter of fact, just before coming into this hall, I met my old friend, or my longtime friend, Judith Chomsky, who, if she can just stand up so people can meet her, who comes from a rather different background than my own, and she will probably confirm when I kept asking her, so how did you react to October 7th? Because I wasn't sure, even though I have no doubt whatsoever about her moral integrity. I wasn't sure because, as I said, reasonable people can disagree and reach different moral judgments. So let me begin with the factual side. There's an aspect of what happened after October 7th, which makes it unique in the history of the Israel-Palestine in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And that is, in the past, when you wanted to look at an authoritative record about what actually happened, what happened during the June 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, what happened during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, what happened during Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, what happened during Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Overwhelmingly, in the past, one was dependent on, reliant on, the human rights reports of the reputable human rights organizations, be it Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, or the local Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. Those reports, in general, were factually accurate, but often the legal conclusions that were drawn from the reports were, let's just say, they were not accurate representations of the factual record, tilting in Israel's favor. But there was a factual record. Now, it's said by Israel's supporters that these human rights organizations are anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. In my view, there is no basis for that claim. Quite the contrary, as I said, the legal conclusions from many of these reports tended to whitewash Israel. But this time around, something different happened. In fact, even as the human rights organizations put out significant reports, we weren't at all dependent on them to reach our factual conclusions about what happened. Why is that? Well, since 2006, Gaza has been under a brutal blockade by Israel and supported, of course, by the US and the EU. And as a result, there are literally dozens of humanitarian organizations that opened up shop in Gaza to mitigate the horror of that medieval blockade. And so this time, when we're trying to assess, to figure out what's been going on in Gaza, we really don't need journalists. As most of you know, Israel has barred any journalists from entering Gaza, but we don't need the journalists. We don't even need the human rights organizations, because we have the on-the-ground testimony, the on-the-ground record of the most reputable human rights organizations, or I should say humanitarian organizations in the world. Most of you in the room will know that in January of this year, South Africa went to the International Court of Justice accusing Israel of being in breach, in violation of the Genocide Convention. And they submitted, the technical term is, they submitted an application to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. The application runs to 84 pages. It's single-spaced, and it has several hundred footnotes, and each footnote contains multiple references. What's interesting about that application, now recall, they are trying to demonstrate to the International Court of Justice that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Who did they depend on? Well, I'll give you a sample. They cite UNESCO. They cite UNICEF. They cite the International Committee of the Red Cross. They cite the World Health Organization. They cite Doctors Without Borders. They cite Save the Children. They cite Committee to Protect Journalists. They cite the World Food Program. They cite CARE. Now, whatever you might want to say about Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and the various local Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations, I would say it's simply not credible, it's not believable that CARE, UNICEF, Save the Children, and all the rest are stocked with anti-Semites. That's simply not believable. The second point to make is there is simply no real disagreement among these organizations. I have read the reports. It's rare, if ever, that, say, the World Health Organization and Save the Children, that they disagree about what's going on in Gaza. There is not just a broad consensus, there is, so far as I can tell, a complete agreement about what's going on in Gaza. So, if you pick up the humanitarian organization reports, you pick up the human rights reports, there is no disagreement, none, that Israel is targeting journalists, Israel is targeting medics, Israel is targeting UN workers, Israel is targeting children in the skull and in the chest. There is no disagreement about that. None. This is not a controversial question. There is no fog of war. When Human Rights Watch, basing itself on all of these on-the-ground organizations, says, as it did in its last report, that Israel is guilty of the crime against humanity and the crime of genocide by systematically, methodically denying water, W-A-T-E-R, denying water to the civilian population of Gaza, that is not a controversial conclusion by Human Rights Watch. The report is filled with scores of references to the various organizations on the ground there. When Human Rights Watch reports that Israel told the people in northern Gaza to flee to the south, as they were fleeing to the south, they were being targeted by the Israeli Army and Air Force, that when they reached the place they were directed to, Israel was dropping 2,000-pound bombs on what were called the safe places that they directed the population to. That is not a controversial question. When it is said that by the World Health Organization that Israel is systematically targeting hospitals in Gaza, when it is said that Israel is systematically targeting the infrastructure in Gaza, the wastewater infrastructure, thank you so much, the wastewater infrastructure, the sanitation infrastructure, when it's targeting the electricity, fuel necessary to operate the basic infrastructure for the medical and the food distribution in Gaza, that is not controversial. So, I think we can fairly say that even in the absence of journalists, and even as the human rights organizations have not played as prominent a role as in the past, though they have clearly produced quality reports, I think it's fair to say that there is no real controversy about what's happening there or has happened there for the past 15 months. Now, there are, I should say, just by way of concluding those remarks, that the broad consensus as of now is that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. I am not here to engage in a kind of hurling of epithets or name-calling. None of the organizations that reached that conclusion reached it easily. The first ones to try to change the so-called discourse about Gaza, because originally the talk was about an Israel-Hamas war. An Israel-Hamas war. But in December 29th, 2023, and then beginning in January 2024, the South African delegation to the International Court of Justice, it said, no, this is not a war that's unfolding in Gaza. It's a genocide that's unfolding in Gaza. And the two, and now I'm speaking not for them, but for myself, the two are very different. In a war, you're trying to inflict a military defeat on the enemy army. In a genocide, you're trying to exterminate the civilian population. The two are very different. So, on a personal note, if you will forgive me, I remember my late parents passed through the Nazi Holocaust, and my late mother would get very indignant when anybody used the word war to describe what she endured. And she would recoil in indignation and say, it wasn't a war. It was an extermination. We were, she said, like roaches. And every time the exterminator shined the light on us, we would scurry in this direction or scurry in that direction, fleeing, and then they would shine the light again on us in an attempt to exterminate us. Us meaning the civilian population. That's not a war. The greatest single work on the Nazi Holocaust was written by a scholar named Raoul Hilberg. And he entitled the work, The Extermination of the European Jews. And it was very striking, the title he chose. No, excuse me, my error. The title was The Destruction of the European Jews. And it was very striking, the title he chose, because he understood, having studied the record in its most minute details, that to describe it as a war against the Jews would be a complete distortion of what happened. It was a destruction aimed not at defeating the enemy army, it was aimed at wiping out a population. Those two things are very different. In the case of Gaza now, in my opinion, but it's an opinion based on closely studying the record, the war aspect of what's gone on in Gaza is trivial and marginal. As of now, fewer than one Israeli soldier has been killed each day in Gaza. Less than one combatant a day. That is not a war. There are people in this room who I assume follow the developments closely in Gaza. And if I were to ask anyone in the room, name me one battle in Gaza. Name me a battle that's been fought. I don't think anyone can come up with a single battle. There are no battles in Gaza. Yes, combatants have been killed. Hamas and other militant group combatants have been killed. But mostly they were killed for the same reason that the civilians were killed, because of the indiscriminate intensive bombing, not because of actual fighting. So, if you look at the major statements that have been made by the most reputable organizations, we can begin. Well, I started with the South African delegation, which said that Israel was committing genocide. The International Court of Justice concluded that there was a plausible, that means a believable case, that Israel was committing genocide. Their final decision will probably come within 1.5 to 2 years. The UN Commission of Inquiry, headed by Navi Pillay, who was the humanitarian head of the UN, they concluded that Israel was committing the crime against humanity of extermination in Gaza. Amnesty International, about 2 months ago, put out a 250-page report in which they concluded Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. And then, as I said most recently, Human Rights Watch put out a report, just like the Amnesty report, extremely impressive. I was surprised by the quality. Sometimes the human rights reports are a little bit slapdash, but these were impressive. And they concluded that Israel was committing the crime of extermination and genocide in Gaza. It's fair to say that there's some room for disagreement there because the law is so technical on these questions. To a lay person, what is the difference between extermination and genocide? Very hard for a lay person to make out the distinction. So maybe it's quote unquote only extermination. Most, I think, non-experts, if that's the right word, most non-experts wouldn't much care about those kinds of distinctions. So I would say there's some room for disagreement, but as I say, within very narrow technical limits. There are two other questions, however, where I think there are areas where reasonable people can disagree and hopefully agree to disagree. The first question, which, as everybody in this room knows, became a kind of litmus test as to whether or not you are a legitimate member of the conversation. And that question was, you might call it the Piers Morgan question. That question was, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? Do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? And I will confess that in the first week or two, it was a source of moral anguish, if not torment, to figure out my way through that question. And so on a little autobiographical note, bearing in mind that Judith Chomsky is in the audience, for most of my adult life, as involved in politics, I had always depended on the moral judgment of Professor Noam Chomsky, who became a friend of mine more than 40 years ago, and I tended to defer to his moral judgment because he was steeped not just in the facts of the situation, he had a terrifying grasp of detail, but he was also steeped in moral philosophy, not just Western. He knew non-Western moral philosophy as well. And so not only did he have excellent political judgment, he had excellent moral judgment. And truth be told, even well into my older years, I was terrified at the prospect of disagreeing with him on these questions. But then, lo and behold, when October 7th came along, he wasn't available, and I was left to my own devices. And I understood many people were interested in what I would have to say for no other particular reason than I had written the only political history of Gaza. There's a very excellent economic history of Gaza written by the Harvard scholar Sarah Roy. But in terms of just going through the minute factual record of the politics of Gaza, I think I'm the only one who had done it, which is not exactly, a huge honor. It's like the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas. It just happened that I specialized in that. And I had to figure out where I stood. Now, let me just begin with the beginning. There was an intuition, a reflex that told me I could not condemn the people who broke through the gates of Gaza. Whatever they did, I could not condemn it. Was that a dogmatic position? Was that radical posing for the cameras? Was that pretending to be holier than thou? Was that being anti-Semitic, or in my case, self-hating? No, I don't believe so. So, on what basis did I refuse to condemn? And as I said a few moments ago, I was listening closely to Judith when I was asking her the question, because I didn't want a clash with her, an old friend whose judgment I deeply respect. So, let's just go through the factual record. First of all, Gaza becomes Gaza as a notable point in geography in 1948, when Israel expels about 300,000 Palestinians from the state of Israel who ended up in Gaza. So the first point to note is Gaza is an overwhelmingly refugee population. As of now, 70% of the people in Gaza are either refugees or descendants of refugees. Number two, Gaza is an overwhelmingly child population. About 48% of Gaza's current population of 2.3 million people are children. That's, so to speak, in the era when I grew up with encyclopedias, that would be to describe the flora and fauna of Gaza. Now, one of the striking things when you look at the scholarship on Gaza, one of the striking things is, beginning when Gaza came under Egyptian rule in 1949, from that moment forward to the present, virtually every outside observer who came to Gaza described it as a concentration camp. Now, some people might say that's inflammatory language. And one can even say, maybe technically, in the language of lawyers, maybe the description is inapt. But the fact remains that that's the image that reflexively came to every outside observer who came to Gaza from 1948 forward. The main UN official in Gaza, in 1955, he wrote, "One does not see people starving or dying of disease in the streets. Nevertheless, the Gaza Strip resembles a vast concentration camp." Albert Gore, as some of you may remember, the former US presidential candidate, his father visited Gaza. His father was a US senator, visited Gaza shortly after the 1967 war. He said, "Gaza is a vast concentration camp on the sand, if you will." A leading sociologist at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Baruch Kimmerling, he wrote a little book in 2003 called Politicide, and he described Gaza as, quote, "the largest concentration camp ever." Now, the head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Eiland, who is still among the living, in his case, I would say, regrettably, Giora Eiland, in 2004, he described Gaza as a huge concentration camp. Now, bear in mind, all of these descriptions come before Israel in 2006 imposes the brutal blockade, the medieval blockade on Gaza. The blockade that's described in official UN reports as a crime against humanity. The blockade in which Israel calculated the caloric intake of each person in Gaza and calculated to keep Gaza on what they called a humanitarian humanitarian minimum diet. A humanitarian minimum diet. And if you read the accounts, Israel said it was determined to keep Gaza just at the edge of the precipice so as to create conditions there awful enough that the people would finally overthrow the elected government in Gaza. By 2006, or I should say, by the eve of October 7th, 2023, The Economist magazine was describing Gaza as a human rubbish heap. The International Committee of the Red Cross called it a sinking ship. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described it as a toxic slum in which more than 2 million people were caged from birth to death. But that's still not the whole story, because periodically Israel went into Gaza on what it called its operations, its high-tech killing sprees, or in that macabre metaphor they called mowing the lawn in Gaza, bearing in mind that half of those 2.3 million blades of grass that were being mowed, skulls that were being cracked, were children. 2004, Operation Rainbow. 2004, Operation Days of Penitence. 2006, Operation Summer Rains. 2006, Operation Autumn Clouds. 2008, Operation Hot Winter. 2008-9, Operation Protective Edge, and so on and so on. Each new Israeli operation left off began where the last one left off, each time intensifying the death and destruction. In Operation Protective Edge, Israel killed about 350 children and destroyed 6,000 homes. Now, when Operation Protective Edge happened, it was considered of such a colossal, ghastly scale that even when I wrote a little book on the topic, I took the title from an Israeli journalist named Gideon Levy in an article he had written, and the book was called "This Time We Went Too Far." It was considered so outrageous what Israel had done. Well, as most of you know, it's not 350 children who are now dead in Gaza. It's probably on the order of 15,000. At the end of Operation Protective Edge, the estimate was there were 600,000 tons of rubble left behind. The current estimate is in Gaza, after 15 months, there is 45 million tons of rubble left behind. After Operation Protective Edge in 2014, about 550 children were killed. About 18,000 homes were destroyed. It was considered such a horror that the head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, he visited Gaza, and bearing in mind, as the head of the ICRC, his main job is visiting war zones, he said, quote, "I've never seen such massive destruction ever before." That was at the end of Operation Protective Edge. The estimate is Israel left behind 2.5 million tons of rubble. And that was already unprecedented. I've never seen such destruction before. And now it's 20 times as much rubble, it has been estimated, has been left behind in Gaza. And the estimates are it will take a minimum of 15 years not to rebuild, but just to clear out the rubble because it's mixed in with unexploded ordnance or weapons and with toxic substances. So that was Gaza on October 6th. it had about 60% unemployment among young people. And all the young people had to look forward to was to get up in the morning and pace the perimeter, the 26 by 5 miles, pace the perimeter of Gaza concentration camp. And the only thing to look forward to is either to die in the next Israeli operation in Gaza, or just to languish in that camp until they were dead. Time doesn't allow me to go through the efforts that Hamas attempted to reach a settlement with Israel, to reach out to the international legal community, and also some people might be dismissive, but that's because they don't know the record. Also, in March 2018, to attempt, in what was called the Great March of Return, to attempt to use nonviolent civil disobedience to end that medieval blockade of Gaza. Turning only to the last, not going through Hamas's legal initiatives, not looking at its diplomatic initiatives, just turning to the last. What happened to the Great March of Return? We know exactly what happened. The UN Commission of Inquiry put out a 250-page single-space report on that Great March of Return. What did it find? It found, quoting the Israelis lined up along the perimeter fence with Gaza its best snipers. And Israel subsequently said, no bullet went awry. Every bullet hit its target. That's what the Israelis said. So where did the bullets hit? According to the copiously documented human rights report, what did the bullets hit? They targeted, and I'm quoting the report now, they targeted children, they targeted medics, they targeted journalists, and they targeted people with disabilities. For example, double amputees, who were, according to the report, standing between 100 and 300 meters from the perimeter fence and engaging in strictly civilian activities, which meant, for those of us who are honest with the facts, that Hamas had exhausted all possible remedies to the situation. Diplomacy, legal recourse, nonviolent civil resistance. And so the people in Gaza were faced by October 6th with two options: to be born into, to languish in, and to die in a concentration camp, or to do something. Now, at this point, I suspect most everybody, at any rate in this room, will agree with me. But then comes October 7th. And how do you morally, if I can use the word, morally adjudicate what happened on October 7th? Now, let me make a couple of stipulations so as for there to be no misconstruing, misunderstanding, misapprehending what I'm about to say. I do not believe, at any rate based on the available evidence, I do not believe, based on the available evidence, that Hamas and the other militant groups, or let's put it in the affirmative, I do believe they committed massive atrocities on that day. I don't think there is any credible evidence, as of now, I'll enter that caveat, that Israel in its counterattack, and for those of you who follow the quote-unquote debate, the Hannibal Directive and so forth, was responsible for the atrocities that occurred on October 7th. About roughly 850 civilians were killed, and I think the evidence is, at this point, if not conclusive, it's overwhelming that it was the Hamas and other militant groups who were responsible for that. However, I should say two other things. Certain things that were said about October 7th do not have any credibility at this point. Number one, the beheading of babies, no. There's no evidence of that. President Biden said he saw pictures of it, which probably is more testament to his mental lucidity than to his discerning capacities. There is no evidence, or let's put it, because I know Judy is a lawyer, there is no material evidence that rape occurred on October 7th. I went through the record very carefully. I will say, without going through it here now, and the editor of my forthcoming book on Gaza is sitting in the table here, Grace, if you want to raise your hand, so she can attest to my going through the evidence. Let's just put it this way. The two main inquiries that have been done on Gaza so far are the UN Commission of Inquiry and Human Rights Watch. And both of them stated that they cannot confirm that rape occurred on October 7th. Now, for me, and I don't claim to be a medical forensic expert, for me, speaking personally, the most compelling evidence that rape did not occur is this. There was an unofficial UN body that went to visit Israel after October 7th. It was headed by this woman named Pramila Patten, and it reached all sorts of scandalous conclusions, but tucked away at the end of the report, she notes that, quote, "We have no medical forensic evidence of rape." No medical forensic evidence of rape. Well, they had an explanation, and the explanation, I'm not saying it's definitive, but it's plausible. They said they were so shocked by the magnitude of the killings that they were just rapidly processing the bodies of the dead and had no time to preserve medical forensic evidence of rape. I would say that's a plausible explanation. But then they said something else. They said that we viewed 50 hours of digital evidence, CCTV, camcorders, dash quarter, 50 hours. It's not a trivial amount. Then they said they looked at 5,000 photographs. And the Pramila Patton report concluded we found none, N-O-N-E, none, no digital or photographic evidence of sexual violence. Once you reach that point, I believe it's no longer plausible to claim, as certain mongers like Sheryl Sandberg claimed, that the Hamas had weaponized rape on October 7th. There is zero evidence of that. And there's always the possibility, some of you know the expression, you can't prove a negative. So it's possible that some person from Gaza grabbed a woman in the southern Israel, went into a cave, and committed sexual violence. That's always possible. But the claims that Hamas weaponized rape on October 7th, as of now, have no material foundation whatsoever. Still, setting aside that, we're faced with an obvious moral dilemma. 800 and more civilians were killed on that day in ways which, judging by the human rights reports, in particular the one put out by Human Rights Watch, were quite grisly and ghastly. What sense do you make of that? And I will say, as I already did, it did pose a dilemma for me. And I had, in recent years, been reading the literature on African American history. And some of you in this room will know that pre-Civil War history, it was occasionally punctuated by slave uprisings, slave revolts. And the revolts were quite grisly and ghastly. So you take the most famous of the slave revolts, it was Nat Turner in 1831. And there's no real dispute about aspects of the revolt. Everybody agrees. Nat Turner gave the order, quote, "Kill all white people." That was the order. And he and his fellow rebels proceeded for the next 72 hours to do just that. They disemboweled men. They smashed to smithereens the skulls of women. They did, unlike Hamas, they did behead babies and then toss them in the fireplace. Well, it doesn't take great imagination to reckon That was pretty horrible. So then I went to the next step. I was curious, what did the white abolitionists have to say about Nat Turner? The white abolitionists were white people who had devoted their lives very courageously to trying to end slavery. However, they were categorically against using violence. They had a strategy that was called moral suasion. We all know the word persuade or persuasion. That is, they were trying to persuade white people that slavery was morally wrong. And as I said, they were categorically against violence. So, what did they have to say about Nat Turner? And it was interesting to read because they refused to condemn Nat Turner. They recognized, as they said, horrible atrocities occurred during the Nat Turner revolt. However, once they acknowledged that atrocities had occurred, they turned to the white people, not the slaves. They turned to the white people. If you read, for example, one of the most famous of the abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, he said, "We told you so. We warned you. We told you so. If you treat people this way, if you degrade them, if you demean them, if you dehumanize them, if you give them no option in this life except to live and die a slave, if that's the only option, you leave them, then don't pretend to shock and surprise when they lash out at you." I found, and of course, we can disagree, as we should always feel free to. Let me just say, I'll say two other things. Number one, I was very struck, and maybe because it's a snobbishness on my part, I was struck by the fact that everybody who knew Nat Turner commented on how smart he was, white or black or white. They all said that Nat Turner, he's a really smart guy. And to understand why a really smart guy would carry out this revolt that targeted every white person, one historian put it this way: yes, rage burned. It burned in Nat Turner. This rage was fed by the prodigious chasm. That means the huge divide, the prodigious chasm between what he was, a slave, and what he aspired to be in this, the only life he had. And that, I believe, was exactly the rage that burned inside each and every one of those young men, mostly in their early 20s, who burst through the gates of Gaza on October 7th, the prodigious chasm between what they aspired to be, and what they were. Inmates, almost every one of those young men had been born into a concentration camp. After 2006, after the blockade, the medieval crime against humanity, that blockade, each of them had to confront every day of their life the fact that by a fluke of fate, they were born into this tiny patch of land, 26 miles by 5 miles, with no past, no present, and no future. And that, in my view, as the person said about Nat Turner, all those gifts, those natural talents and gifts, which each of us in different aspects of our being, all those gifts would be squandered in this toxic dump called Gaza. Now, for those of you who have been willing to go with me that far, there's still the question, what about the innocents killed? And I'm conflicted about this, but I will go by the international law. I will grant they were all, by international law, the 850 civilians, they were by international law civilians. What of them? How can you justify that? So I was reading about Nat Turner, and I came across this editorial by an organization called the New York Working Men's Party. The New York Working Men's Party. And they started out like any sane, rational person would by saying, unjustifiable atrocities occurred during the Nat Turner revolt. And I don't think that can be disputed. Unjustified atrocities occurred during Nat Turner's revolt and on October 7th. But then they went on to say the following. Of what were these Negroes guilty? Of putting to death men, women, and children. But for what purpose? Thievery? No. There's no evidence that such was their purpose. On the contrary, almost all the accounts concur in stating that what was their purpose? They expected to emancipate themselves. And they no doubt thought, and here I would like you to pay attention to how, in my view, a decent, compassionate person recognizing that atrocities occurred, unjustifiable atrocities, how they reasoned it through. Almost all the accounts concur in stating that they expected to emancipate themselves. And they no doubt thought that their only hope of doing so, of freeing themselves, was to put to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage. And then they go on to say, if such were their impressions, if that's what they believed, weren't they justifiable in doing so? Weren't they justifiable in putting to death indiscriminately the whole race of those who held them in bondage? And then the editorial concludes, undoubtedly, they were justified. If freedom is the birthright of man, as the Declaration of Independence tells us. Now, I will say one last thing, and then just one other topic, and then I will gracefully walk off stage and spare you anymore. The fact of the matter is, at the time of the revolt, even as white people were shocked, appalled, enraged, went on rampages, randomly picking out black people, cutting off their heads, and putting them on stakes. It was a very ugly retaliation. Even as white people were shocked, appalled, and outraged, and went on homicidal rampages, the evidence shows most black people agreed with Nat Turner. They supported him. So when you hear stories about how the majority of Gazans supported October 7th, I would have to say, if you look at the record of the slave revolts, oh, thank you. I thought it was the note to shut up. Okay. If you look at the record of the slave revolts, the people in Gaza reacted exactly as black people in the United States did after the Nat Turner revolt. But there's a second aspect to it. The greatest of the abolitionists, the black abolitionists, say Frederick Douglass, who, if you don't know his name and you're still of school age, you should definitely read him. He was a very impressive, brilliant orator, very impressive guy. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. He was against violence to try to overthrow slavery until the Civil War, of course. He called Nat Turner one of our, quote, revolutionary fathers, one of our glorious martyrs. And the fact of the matter is, our own history, and here I don't mean Afro-American history, I mean non-hyphenated American history. Nat Turner now occupies a revered place in American history. Was it because they're celebrating the atrocities, or our country is celebrating the atrocities that were committed by Nat Turner? No, I don't believe so. It's a recognition that his action traces back to an indomitable will, an irrepressible will to be free. That's his ultimate source, that indomitable, irrepressible will to be free. And I believe the correct answer to the question do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? It's said in Jewish lore that Jews always answer a question with a question. And so my response is, do you condemn Nat Turner? And as far as I can tell, the overwhelming consensus now is to recognize that notwithstanding the atrocities that he committed, that he still is a point in the trajectory of what's sometimes called the African American freedom struggle that climaxed in the Civil War. Now, that leaves me with one last question, and then, as I said, I will clear the podium. That question is, you might call it Piers Morgan question 2. Quote, what did you expect Israel to do? What did you expect Israel to do? Or the other version of it, namely, doesn't Israel have the right to self-defense? Now, that question has to be divided into 2 parts. Part number 1, is Israel engaging in a war of self-defense? As I said earlier, in my opinion, that's a disguise. The war aspect of the last 15 months has been relatively, and even absolutely in terms of numbers, the war aspect has been trivial. Less than 1 soldier killed per day. Far less, actually, than 1 soldier killed a day. So the first point to make, Mr. Morgan, is it's not a war. It's a genocide. So you should be asking your invitees, do you believe Israel has the right to commit genocide? Because that's actually what's happening. But let's leave that aside. Let's leave that aside for a moment. Here we come to slightly trickier moral ground. But let's say they were engaging in self-defense. Let's say they were targeting Hamas militants. Let's say they were targeting only what are called in the laws of war, only military objects. Did they have that right? And here, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to use a very simple analogy. Now, we all know that analogies are never perfect. What makes an analogy is significant aspects of 2 situations are comparable. It doesn't mean every aspect is comparable. So here I'm going to make a simple analogy, and then you decide for yourself. So, this woman marries a fellow, and he turns out to be a spousal batterer. He beats her, he torments her, he tortures her. Day in and day out, he's battering this woman. She lets out screams. She lets out yells. She lets out agony and torment. hoping to capture the attention of a passerby or passersby who will intervene. People hear the screams, they hear the shrieks of torment, but they don't do anything. Then she summons up the courage and she calls the police. The police come. They do a thorough investigation, like Human Rights Watch, like Amnesty International, like a large number of human rights organizations. And they reach the conclusion that yes, what she's saying is true. And they write up a report and they give it to the district attorney. Just like those human rights reports that were submitted to the United Nations, to the International Criminal Court, and a dozen other responsible legal bodies. And what happened to those reports? They were filed away like the police report that was given to the district attorney. They were filed away in a drawer, just there to collect dust. There are two places that I know of where those reports collect dust. One was with the bodies that received them, and the other is the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of those reports that are collecting dust on my bookshelves at home. They document the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, page after page after page. And like that woman, the report documenting her brutalization, the district attorney files it in the desk drawer to collect dust. Now, one day, as he was approaching her, she decided it was her do or die moment. And she grabs a knife, a kitchen knife, and she stabs him. And she stabs him a second time. And she stabs him a third time. At this point, he reaches for his pistol and he kills her. Now, if he went to court, more likely than not, he would get off on self-defense. As a legal matter, he had the right to self-defense. Just as legally, Israel had the right to self-defense after October 7th. I'm leaving aside the genocide. I'm just saying if they targeted only Hamas militants and military objects. But then I have a question for everybody in this room. Even if, as a legal matter, he had the right to self-defense, the question remains, as a moral matter, did he have the right to kill her? Now, some of you may know Martin Luther King. And when he was trying to defend nonviolent civil resistance in the South, he, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, quoted Saint Augustine. And Saint Augustine was famously said, an unjust law is no law at all. An unjust law is no law at all. And I believe, and reasonable people can disagree, but my belief is, after torturing the people of Gaza since 1967, but infinitely worse after the imposition of that blockade, punctuated by the high-tech killing sprees, sometimes twice a year, sometimes every 2 years, that Israel had forfeited its right to self-defense. Thank you. Yes, I'll take questions. I want to just quickly, I'm very happy to speak to you, believe me, but I know I have to address the question of the ceasefire, which obviously should be pressing for everybody. I'm just going to say a few words about the ceasefire. Number one, people have, I'm afraid, short memories. This ceasefire is not the first one of its kind in exactly the same moment. Operation Cast Lead began on August 26, 2008, and it ended January 17th, 2009. Why do I mention it? It ended January 17th, 2009, because Barack Obama was going to be inaugurated as the new president of the United States. And he told Israel, I don't want my inauguration to be distracted by what you're doing in Gaza. The message was passed. Israel ended the war. In this case, if you were to ask me what happened, I would say it's perfectly obvious what happened. About a month or less, 3 weeks ago, President-elect Trump said that if the hostages were not released, all hell would break loose in Gaza. And now he had a genuine problem. The problem is all hell was already let loose in Gaza under Biden. There was not much he could do to top that act. Number two, he didn't want to come into office looking like a monster. And so to top what Biden and Blinken allowed to happen would, as it were, mar his image. But if he did nothing after saying all hell would break loose if the hostages weren't released, if he did nothing, then he would come across as a blowhard. And so, like Mr. Obama, he passed the word to Netanyahu, don't mess up my inauguration or put me in an embarrassing position, agree to the hostage exchange. And the Israelis immediately caved in, as they did when Obama gave the order. However, as all of you know, there was supposed to be more to that ceasefire. There was supposed to be, as the previous speaker mentioned, 600 trucks of humanitarian aid were supposed to be allowed in each day. I do not believe, and I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but I do not believe there is any possibility whatsoever that that's going to happen. And phase 3 was supposed to be the rebuilding, the reconstruction in Gaza. I do not believe there is any possibility whatsoever that that's going to happen. Israel has had and has a clear goal, or has had a clear goal, and that is to once and for all solve the Gaza question. And they are not going to allow for the Gaza question to slowly but surely reappear again, which would be the consequence of reconstruction. So I do not believe that beyond the hostage exchange, any of that agreement is going to hold up. Okay, I was asked to take a few questions from you.
I have a question regarding Joe Biden. Why do you think Joe Biden was not able to stop the war in May while Trump had the ability to do so?
Well, I think the answer to that question speaks for itself. He did not want to stop it. He had all the power to stop it. Israel is incapable of breathing a single breath without the green light from the US, without the daily supplies of weapons from the US, without the American veto in the Security Council. Israel could not survive a millisecond without the US support. But the US administration believed, in my opinion, that Israel serves an important strategic function in the Middle East. It appeared to have been very weak, both in not anticipating, notwithstanding its very sophisticated technology, surveillance technology, it appeared to be very weak on October 7th. And they believed, like Israel, that Israel has to restore, the fancy term is called deterrence capacity. And that just means the Arab world's fear of it. So I imagine some of you, even in this room, though you won't publicly own up to it, some of you were thinking after October 7th, maybe Israel isn't as strong as we thought it was. Maybe Israel isn't militarily invincible if this ragtag army in Hamas, in Gaza, could inflict such a deadly blow on Israel. And so Israel had to restore its deterrence capacity, the Arab world's fear of it, and it proceeded to do so by annihilating Gaza, so as to transmit the message. If you have this idea running through your head that you have a military option against us, look at Gaza, or what's left of it. And the Biden-Blinken administration, I think, shared that opinion, that Israel needed, not just for itself, but as a strategic asset of the United States, Israel needed to put Hamas and anyone else who gets these ideas in their head to put them back in place?
My question has to do with the popular opinion in Israeli population. I have immense respect for you being the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas, and for all of the meticulous work that you've done. And it just is mind-boggling how it seems that that information that was so incredibly easy to understand does not seem to be reaching a population that is seems like born brainwashed to think that that's not the real story or the true story. So I guess my question is what are your hopes for reaching or for bringing that information there in a way that's received, and what are the obstacles to that you see?
I lived during the Vietnam War, and it was not difficult to discern that the United States was committing atrocities of an unspeakable magnitude against the people of Vietnam. The estimates are that 2 million Vietnamese were killed, about 1 million Laotians were killed, and about 750,000 Cambodians were killed. At a certain point, the US was dropping the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs on Vietnam every month. Now, there were some people who denied that the US was committing atrocities. You could see them every day on television, which was the mode of communication in my generation. And I remember my late mother once commenting, "Those who want to know, know. Those who don't want to know will never know." In the case of Israel, there is another situation. They know what's being done. I do not accept the often claimed defense that they're brainwashed, that the media doesn't tell them the truth, that they are lied to, and that accounts for the overwhelming support that Israeli citizens have lent to what's going on. The polls show that 95% of Jewish Israelis believe either that Israel is using the right amount of force or too little support. Oh, it's too little force. Now, the argument is they're brainwashed, they're lied to. That's not really tenable. Israel is one of the most technologically sophisticated countries on earth. Everybody's on the web. Everybody's watching those images. Everybody knows what's going on. It's not a secret. Everybody knows what's going on. Not just from the images on, I don't use the social media, but I'll use names that you're familiar with, TikTok, Instagram, and so forth. There are 2 other aspects. Number 1, Israel is a citizen army. That means everybody except for not marginal, but apart from certain isolated sectors, serves in the army. It means your brother, your sister, your mother, your father, your uncle, your son, your grandson. They all are hearing stories about what's going on in Gaza. Number two, if you look at, for example, the report on genocide that was written by an Israeli historian, who I met, by the way, the other day, Lee Mordechai. What was most striking about Lee Mordechai's substantial documentation of what he calls the genocide in Gaza, what was most striking about it is a very large part of the documentation, and you read it for yourself. Just Google Lee Mordechai Gala, a genocide, Mordechai. Yes. What's most striking is a large part of the documentation consists of videos that are posted by the Israeli soldiers of the horrific crimes that are being committed there. Now, they post that stuff in the knowledge and the assurance that they're not going to be ostracized for what they're doing, but that quite the contrary, what they're doing is being approved by their fellow Israeli citizens. So, if you ask me what's my expectation, I will say to you, my expectation of Israelis, of being enlightened about what's happening, my expectation is the same as one's expectation would have been of whites before the civil rights movement. It's largely forgotten in our history, but when African Americans were lynched, they were not lynched by men in white hoods in the dead of night. That's not true. They were lynched during picnics when children were let out of school early, workers were let out of work early, the mother packed the picnic basket, they went to the campgrounds, they watched as the black person was lynched, his body set on fire, and then at the end of the lynching, the body parts were auctioned off. The heart, the liver, and the various other body parts were auctioned off. Is it, in that context, is it a realistic expectation that more information is going to enlighten these people about the wrongness of their acts? I find that, to put it charitably, most implausible. Israel is as the Israeli human rights organization Bensalem, a few years ago, it put out a report. It's called the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. And they put out a report on the question of whether Israel is an apartheid state. And they said as follows. They said there is only one state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. One state, and that state is built on the foundation, the principle of Jewish supremacy. Israel is a Jewish supremacist state. But I would have to add, it's not just a Jewish supremacist state. Sometimes, and I belong to the tradition of the left, the political left, we like to make the distinction between the state and society on the assumption that the state has its interests, and those interests are in conflict with the interests of ordinary people, society. And in some cases, that distinction is valid. During the Vietnam War, at least at its height, beginning, say, in 1968, during the Vietnam War, at its height, it's clearly fair to say that the state was not representing the feelings of a large part of American society, what came to be called the anti-war movement. That's not true in Israel. The state and the society are one. It's a Jewish supremacist state and a Jewish supremacist society. And after what happened on October 7th, it became a homicidal Jewish state and society. And it's not because they were brainwashed. It's not because they fail to have read my one book on the subject. No, they are fully, completely, totally cognizant of what they're doing, but they are Jewish supremacists for whom Arab life is worthless.
Can we get one big round of applause for Dr. Finkelstein?